sense in terms of messaging, but also, conversations that we should be having with voters. And so I decided that the smartest political people in America were big city mayors or small town mayors, and that we should bring them in. And I had heard a lot about Pete from a lot of people, as an extraordinarily talented politician, but also just a great thinker, incredible Renaissance guy. And I thought, yeah, right. I mean, how good can he really be? That's what I thought to myself. And really, from the moment that he started speaking about um, his vision for the country, his vision for his city, his vision for our political party, but mostly his vision for America and how we need to communicate our patriotism and our faith and our ideas. I just thought he is a rare talent. So it was no surprise when he was invited into the Biden administration for the all important role of infrastructure manager and taking a look at transportation. But probably since you all have, since the last presidential election, you've seen him a lot. You've seen him out there doing podcasts, being so incredibly generous with his time. Anyone who asks him, including the work that we do at the Institute of Politics, he stepped up and said, yep, it is go time. And that's not without a lot of sacrifice from somebody who's been in the cabinet for 4 years, traveling all around the country. Somebody who I'm sure most days would like to stay home and not have another event on his calendar. But that extraordinary talent of, as Obama once said about Bill Clinton, he's the explainer in chief. I think that's the role, Pete, that you have taken on, being the explainer in chief of what's going on in America and how we can revitalize this country for working people, how we can revitalize it for rural people, and how we need to have a conversation about change, but also about kind of traditional values. And so it's great to have you. And thanks so much for joining us here at the summit.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the kind words. Likewise, I've thought very, very highly of Senator Heitkamp long before she'd ever heard of me, and also really appreciated the chance to work under your aegis at the Institute of Politics and team up on a number of things that I think are about really making sure voices from places like where you come from and where I come from are heard and are part of a conversation that just hasn't always connected, especially in Washington. And some of the things that I believed about the Washington process when I was a mayor, trying to knock on the door of some of those buildings. When I got to there and got inside some of those buildings, I came to feel that way even more strongly. And we were able to make a lot of headway delivering results for rural communities. But I also saw just how disconnected the conversation too often becomes from what people are actually up against. My vocabulary and my approach on all of these things was fashioned in South Bend, Indiana, which is a city that went through a tremendous amount of upheaval economically. A lot of it played out before I was born. But by the time I was running for mayor, the big question was, can this ever be a place that young people stay in, or is our great export going to continue to be young people? And we saw a way to have a different future and change the answer. And part of that was through infrastructure, part of that was through economic vision, part of that was through just different ways of teaming up. And I've seen the power of these kinds of conversations and that kind of outreach. And very glad that this convening is another example of that. So thanks for the chance to speak with you about everything that we're all facing today.
Well, I mean, it's really exciting because when things are really bad, there's always the only direction is up. And that means that we have a chance to kind of restructure how we have those conversations, to have I think, a more meaningful dialogue. And one of the things that concerns me, never mind the brain drain that you just talked about, where young people don't see an opportunity in rural America, we see more and more conservatives and liberals self-selecting their neighborhoods and not wanting to be around each other. And that has, I think, exacerbated. I saw this in the urban rural divide, but I'm seeing it generationally and now gender wise,
Hmm.
with young men becoming more conservative, young women more liberal, and really this great divide of not having conversations with each other. How do we fix that? How do we, especially thinking about having a dialogue in rural America that is going to create kind of ideological diversity, not just
Yeah.
a single thought process. How do we change that?
Well, yeah, I think that that sorting that you've talked about has really been supercharged by the algorithms that drive how most of us get so much of our information. This is especially true for younger generation that makes me feel old-fashioned for things like occasionally watching television on a television, which exactly zero out of the students I spent time with at the Institute were doing. And I know is less and less how my neighbors here in rural Michigan, where I live now, get their information either. And what that means is instead of hearing from journalists who were answering to an editor whose job was to make sure that different sides were heard, I pick up my phone and I see basically two things. Here's somebody I already agree with looking good, and here's somebody I already didn't like that much doing something disagreeable that reminds me why I didn't like them. And that has played out to the degree that really has been, I think, unprecedented in the modern political and social landscape we have. Which means that I think our salvation has to come from the offline. And when I think about the antidote to that, I so often think about the human, in-person, 3D, in real life relationships that transcend those partisan and social divides. And I think this is actually one area where rural America has a lot to offer. Because people who live in smaller communities often have more overlapping circles of belonging because so many families that straddle political divides also have neighbors or faith communities or professional circumstances that can get off of the kind of pre-sorted concentric circles that we all live in with our online identities. We can create more of those encounters, still fiercely contested sometimes. I mean, again, I come out of local politics and government, and I know how heated things can get sometimes in a local process, but I think we were always better able to see each other as three-dimensional people in those processes than when we're behind a keyboard commenting on what's going on nationally. And if we want to light the way out of this moment and what it's done to our social and political fabric, I really think creating more of those spaces for those kinds of encounters. And there's so many ways to do it. From service, and I've always been a believer in military service, but also just national service and community service, to creating more of those kind of social environments where this happens. I think it's a really critical part to how we break this polarization that otherwise will truly pull us apart to where we can't feel like one country anymore.
One of the challenges that you have is, number one, programs that are designed to kind of for public service like AmeriCorps are seeing tremendous reductions and almost a phase out kind of status at this point. But I want to raise something with you because it's something that I always say: North Dakota and rural America has always been conservative. I don't think that we should pretend that it hasn't, but there's always been a conversation that happens at the local cafe, conversation that
Right.
happens. I always say, guys sitting around the table, usually solving the problems of the world that day,
Mhm.
having a great conversation. But there was always diversity of thought because people were willing to kind of express their opinion, and there wasn't that kind of anger or them versus us, or if you side on this side or that side, you're unpatriotic or you're racist or you're this. And so what I will tell you that I've seen, Pete, is I've seen those kinds of tables diminish where, again, you think, where you're talking about 3D, but somebody says something that they disagree with, and rather than saying, can we just kind of explore that, can we talk about that, they get up and leave the table because
Yeah.
they don't want to have that conversation because it's gotten so aggressive and
Mhm.
so angry. And so how do we get folks, once again, who have an opinion in rural America that may be different than the dominant opinion, to feel comfortable in what they know, to feel comfortable in what they're saying? How do we fix that?
Mhm.
Because three-dimensional won't work unless somebody's willing to have the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one thing we really need is folks who are willing to step up and express these ideas in places where they might not seem natural. This is something I do all the time. I mean, famously spend a lot of time on Fox News, but I also try to do this in online spaces and podcasts where people might not have heard from somebody who has my political values, especially because we find out that there are overlaps that you wouldn't expect. I think some of this is about tone, finding people where they are, appreciating that if any one of us had a different background, a different news diet, a different upbringing, we might have a different politics. And so it just isn't believable that your politics make you a good or bad person. And on the contrary, all of us find that we're a product of the influences that have acted on us, and we get to be one of those influences if we speak up where it might not always be comfortable. I think there's a respectful way to do it, of course, and tone matters a lot. I think, definitely the Midwest where I came from equipped me with a certain set of norms about how to talk through disagreements that I think has served me well when I've gone into different environments, both digitally and geographically around the US. But if we're not ready to have comfortable, serious conversations that happen with conviction and respect at the same time, then I don't think we're even really doing our duty as citizens, let alone getting what has to happen done in the political space to happen.
Well, I will say this, and it is those people out there watching this go, yeah, I mean, if I were as smart and knowledgeable and erudite as Pete Buttigieg, I'd be out there. But I don't have those skills. I don't have that knowledge. I don't have that confidence that he has, that he knows he can get in a meaningful, respectful debate and make an impact and actually educate those people on the edge. You know, and I know that probably about 30% of the people live in the extremes and the rest are watching. And so
Right.
frequently what they're watching is they're watching a one-sided debate because there
Mhm.
isn't another side presented. So how do we get people comfortable with their ability to have that conversation without getting angry, without alienating more people, and without just walking away? Because every time I see someone generalize a Republican voter in a way that I know only plays into the hands of the Republic,
Yeah.
of the MAGA crowd, that is destructive. And so we need more people who are having those meaningful, and direct. I mean, I don't think you need to give your values up, but those meaningful, direct conversations. And people don't feel comfortable in that
Yeah.
space anymore.
Well, one thing I think is important is that you're always at your most credible talking about what you know and what you've experienced and what you've lived. The whole point of politics is that it affects everyday life. And the whole reason I'm in politics is I want everyday life to get better in a number of specific ways that I think are connected to the policies and the values that I believe in. And everyone's an expert. You don't have to be an expert in the finer points of the tax code to be an expert in your own life and how you've been impacted by things. I just had a really moving conversation a few days ago with a woman and a mother in North Carolina who did everything right, and she and her spouse their employer insurance only goes so far in taking care of their daughter because she was born very premature and has extreme long-lasting effects from that. And Medicaid is the only reason that their daughter is able to live in their home with them. And it is just a pillar of their day-to-day life as a family. And as Washington was taking action and President Trump was preparing to sign the bill that cut Medicaid, I had a chance to hear from her and to share online her story to help remind folks what was at stake there. Everybody's got personal stakes in the policies that are being kicked around like political footballs right now. Uh, everything from transportation. I used to always say when I was Secretary of Transportation, everybody's an expert, and I don't mean that sarcastically, on what transportation means to them. It's true in terms of all of these policy things at stake, though, from what's going on in our environment to family policies and some of the freedoms that we count on that make it possible for a family like mine to exist. Start there because it's a lot harder for somebody to contradict you when you're talking about how a political decision is affecting your own life.
Although, one of the things that I had a person on Facebook that I read out of Fargo who had a conversation with our senator who said, "Oh, this won't affect me." He explained how it's not going to affect me. And so, that the kind of and one of the things that you can start with if you're talking about Medicaid, you want to say you're cutting almost $1 trillion out of Medicaid over 10 years, and they're trying to convince you that no one is going to be hurt by that.
Right.
Only 30-year-olds in the basement of their parents who are slackers are going to get hurt, and illegal immigrants who don't qualify for Medicaid. And so one of the challenges that we have is to dispel this kind of myth about what the big beautiful bill will do. And so I want to start out just kind of, because I said you're the explainer in chief, so you're now on the hot seat. So what do you say to someone who has been told by their congressional member or by their senator that this won't hurt a child on Medicaid who is disabled? Don't worry, because that's not who's going to suffer repercussions. How do you respond to that, Pete?
Well, I would say that the congressional Republicans are telling on themselves. They claimed $1 trillion from these Medicaid provisions. And the only way you could possibly save $1 trillion is if millions of people who do in fact qualify, who are in fact eligible today, lose their coverage. There is always some margin in any system that you want to tighten up and improve, but there simply isn't $1 trillion of waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicaid. It's just not there. And so the only way to cut that much money out of the program is to kick that many people off of their care. Another way to look at it is to just line up the simple arithmetic of this bill. So, for example, they tucked in a $50 billion fund to make it look like they were concerned about rural hospitals. But we already know that at least 3 times that much money is going to be cut from the amount of Medicaid going to rural areas, which is, of course, the lifeblood of a lot of these hospitals. And we've already lost more than 50 or 60 rural hospitals just since 2017. And we've already seen one close just a few weeks ago, citing these Medicaid cuts as a reason they just weren't going to be able to keep on going. The best estimates I've seen say that about 300 more rural facilities, hospitals, and clinics will close as a result of that bill. There's just no pretending otherwise. And it's really important for people who've been affected by the closures that have already happened to know that they do have something on the line. Another thing I would say is that there's no American who is unaffected by this bill. Some people may think to themselves, look, I'm not rich enough to get these tax breaks. I'm also not low income enough to be affected by the Medicaid cuts or the SNAP cuts. So this doesn't mean anything to me. What you got to remember is there's no way to put $3 trillion on the deficit, which is what they just did, without that being something every one of us has to pay for. We're paying for it with higher interest rates. We're paying for it with a national debt that we're going to be saddled with for years. And so even if you make too much money to be affected by the benefit cuts, and even if you're not rich enough to qualify for the tax cuts, you're absolutely affected by this bill. All of us are.
Yeah, I mean, and the one thing that I do talk about, because state attorneys general have a unique role in Medicaid fraud. And so I just always remind people that there are probably 30 Republican AGs out there who have been tasked with the job of investigating waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicaid. Call them up and ask them why they're not doing their job. Call them up and say, why haven't you ferreted out waste, fraud, and abuse? And it's interesting, in my state of North Dakota, the last year that you could find data, it's a 75-25 match. The state pays 25% for that program. The federal government pays 75%. North Dakota got almost $1 million in money to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse, and found $350. $350. I mean, people say, well, it's just waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, there already is a program to investigate that. And, the challenge that you should issue is, why haven't you curtailed waste, fraud, and abuse under this program where we're already paying you to investigate? And so it's just so simple to say, oh, if we change the way that we distribute SNAP benefits, or whether there's going to be a state share in SNAP benefits, no one's going to get hurt. And you're like, really? I mean, you can say you don't care if people get hurt. You can say you don't care if people are taken off this kind of benefit, but you can't say people won't struggle to try and make ends meet. And I don't want to dominate the time, but I tell this story about a guy who came into my office when I was in the Senate, and he ran a number of fast food restaurants. And he was complaining about the government. And I just kept saying, what about the government? What are you mad about the government? And he would, it's just waste and blah, blah, blah. And finally, I just said, so what do you pay your workers an hour? He said, $10. And this was a few years ago, it's probably 15 now. And I said, what do you think that is in terms of somebody who works for 40 hours a week and gets an annual? I mean, what is that annually? About $25,000. I said, how does anyone live on that? And so when the Secretary of Treasury says, oh, how you're going to replace this is you're going to get a job, and that job's going to pay for insurance, for your insurance. I mean, that is just not the reality, and certainly not the reality in rural America, where so many small businesses are exempt from the Obamacare requirement to basically provide health insurance. And so help me explain to folks on why getting a job, or many of these people who are on Medicaid are in fact working.
Mhm.
They're working in jobs where the employer doesn't pay health insurance. And in your case, working where a disabled child couldn't possibly, I mean, that the health insurance that would be provided by an employer is not nearly adequate to deal with the needs of that child.
Absolutely. I mean, look, this is something that I think a lot of folks miss in the narrative is that we're talking about working people. There are. I mean, this is definitely going to hurt some people who are unable to work, but this is also hurting a lot of people who are working right now. Remember, part of how this bill works is it inundates people with paperwork, so that even if they're working, it's harder to prove that they're working, or it puts them on a more vulnerable footing where if you're an hourly worker and your hours get cut, not because you wanted to work less, but because your employer doesn't give you a steady, reliable schedule. Not only do you lose the income, but now you might also lose your health care. Nobody's better off other than, I guess, the folks who get the tax breaks that this is paying for, the wealthy people. But nobody else is better off when this happens because, of course, when people lose their health care, that makes our entire country worse off. Indeed, if people aren't getting the preventative health care they need, they're going to be less able to work in the future because they're more likely to have untreated chronic issues, or even, as many experts have pointed out, perhaps even lose their lives. There's about 50,000 premature deaths a year that are expected to happen as a consequence of this bill. So you can't say that this is only getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, and then have any credible answer for why getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse ought to kill 50,000 Americans a year.
Yeah, and the other just health insurance on the exchanges, guess what? That is not going to be affordable anymore. In fact, in North Dakota, the average Obamacare exchange premium will go up 50 to 70%. And so, and going back to the rural hospitals, what do you think uncompensated care does to a rural hospital
Exactly.
that's operating on a 1% margin?
Exactly. What's going to happen is you're going to stop somebody from getting preventative care. They're going to be in a desperate situation. They'll go to the emergency room instead of the cardiologist. The rural hospital will, of course, take care of them because they're not going to allow them to go untreated in the emergency room. And then the hospital eats it, and it's part of why the hospitals are closing.
Yeah. So I want to, we have about 15 minutes before you have to go get your kids. But I wanted to just offer some, I mean, ray of hope that we can, in fact, uh, stem the tide of rural America becoming ideologically one note, that we can, in fact, expand. But, and this is a little touchy, I'll admit it, but one of the reasons why it's so difficult is because frequently the National Democratic Party narrative is so toxic to rural America. And it's toxic in part, as you know, as you said, when you just get your news from one source, right? And that one source just exaggerates maybe one thing, or demonizes one thing that frightens people in terms of cultural changes. But one of the things that I would say, that has, I think, woken up a lot of people about the cultural differences has been, ever since Roe v. Wade was reversed by the Dobbs decision, everybody just assumed that rural America was pro-life America. And one thing that we've discovered with these initiated measures and with protections is that's not true. So we know there's people out there who share, the value of a woman's right to choose, or the ability of government to stay out of your business and for you to be free to make your choice. How do we overcome kind of that national narrative that the Democratic Party is a party of elites and they don't care about rural America?
Well, I think the truth is the party's got some work to do in terms of communicating its values more clearly and in more places. It's what we have to say, it's how we say it, but importantly, it's also where we say it. And that's why I think outreach, both geographic outreach to rural communities and digital outreach to spaces that don't always hear from us, is important. I think it's also important to appreciate that very few people have a simple party line set of values. All of us have complicated, overlapping values. And I know a lot of folks who are more conservative socially, but are outraged by the way that Republicans are giving tax breaks to the wealthy and cutting low-income people off of coverage. I know a lot of other folks who are in the business community. They're economically a little more conservative, but they're extremely troubled by the attack on rights and freedoms that has happened in the social realm. So my point is, there's a chance to build a different kind of coalition right now. And in order for that coalition to succeed, we really have to do two things. We have to make clear what these harms are. We definitely have to do that, and not allow anybody, for example, a member of Congress. I live in one of the most rural congressional districts east of the Mississippi. My member of the Congress promised not to cut Medicaid, and then he voted for that along with President Trump just a few days ago. Of course, people need to hear that. But people also need to understand what it is we're for, how that everyday life gets better if you have leadership with different values. And I think my party has struggled to explain what it's for. And yet we can paint a picture of what it looks like when government actually works for you. It's not about making it bigger or smaller. It's about making sure that you get up in the morning and you're breathing cleaner air because your government did a good job of keeping that under control, and you're on a good road to get to where you need to go because you had a successful infrastructure policy, and you've got a good school to drop your kid off because we actually invest in education instead of cutting the Department of Education out. And you go to a job that you know you can count on because you have policymakers who care about employment in your area. And I could go on and on, but it's that different and better everyday life. And I think it's going to be twice as important to explain what we're trying to deliver, given the enormous changes that are coming our way. Not just the changes that have been created by our political moment, but the changes that are coming about because of technology, especially including artificial intelligence, that is going to change every line of work in every part of the country very, very quickly.
Well, and if you think about the kind of message of the Democratic Party, and I think that for three presidential cycles, and I know these are all friends of ours, but the message is we're not Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That makes us somehow morally superior. It makes us somehow better. And we lost two elections saying that our party did, and damn near lost a third. We always forget how close the 2020 election was in spite of COVID. And so how come we have such a hard, I mean, what I always hear is, why do people in rural America vote against their interest? And I just say, nobody votes against their interest. You just
Yep.
haven't figured out what their interest is, and you
Yep.
haven't communicated how you are going to help people, or not help people, but work with communities to design a better system of opportunity and protections for communities. I mean, our friend David Axelrod always says people, Democrats approach rural America like missionaries and not neighbors.
I think that's right, and it has to, this has to be a conversation among equals. It can't be done with that kind of condescension. I mean, if I have a friend who's maybe a liberal attorney who's in a coastal city making enough money to actually win on these Trump tax cuts, and they're saying at a Democratic fundraiser with me, how come these Trump voters are voting against their interest? I could say, so are you. So, we've got to have a conversation, and it's the kind of conversation I'm trying to have with my neighbors here in rural Michigan, where, the folks who live by me, they don't have Donald Trump lawn signs. They have Donald Trump flags. And yet, when you get folks out from behind the keyboard and talk about what we really care about, people do want a country where there is more mutual respect, where there is more decency in high office, where there is attention to what so many of us believe, certainly in the Christian tradition, about taking care of your neighbor and looking after the least among us, and a whole bunch of other values that are, in my view, American values, better served by a very different kind of leadership than what we have in today's White House. We can have that conversation, but we have to do as much listening as we do talking.
Well, and we have to come with ideas, and with a sense of principles and values that are mutual. I always say, if you asked a small business owner in Carrington, North Dakota, town of about 2 to 3,000 people now, if you asked them, what do you want out of life, as opposed to how do you vote, what do what's your impression of this president, what's your impression of Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or whoever they equate as a leader of the Democratic Party. You get rid of that and say, what do you want? And you asked a liberal in New York, there wouldn't be much difference between what they want for this country. But yet our political system has created a division among people that is toxic, and it can't continue, and it is now playing out in a very dangerous way by advancing political violence, not just incivility, but political violence. And so, how do we lead in that discussion?
Well, I think there's two sets of values we need to be appealing to. One is a set of values that some folks might not share, but most Americans do. So when I talk about some of the things that I think are really important, to me at least, as a matter of policy, they're not just things Democrats care about. They're things about two-thirds of Americans agree on, whether it's making sure the wealthy pay their fair share in taxes, or trusting women to make their own healthcare decisions, or making sure that as part of responsible gun ownership, there are universal background checks for people who want to purchase weapons, or any other number of things. We can disagree about them, but two-thirds of Americans agree on those things, and we need to highlight those. There's another set of things that 100% of Americans ought to agree on, that this is a republic, not a monarchy, that political violence, whoever it's directed at and whatever the rationale, is completely unacceptable, that nobody's above the law, that courts decide what is legal or illegal, and politicians need to follow that, that everyone, no matter what they're accused of, ought to have due process. These are things that we need to insist on as universal American and really human values. And anytime we see those values tested, even when it's inconvenient for our own side, or at least when it doesn't fit neatly into some ideological narrative, we need to be all about it. I recently became part of a project called We Hold These Truths, which is Democrats, Republicans, and independents, some very prominent conservatives, some more left-leaning people, and Democrats like me, putting together a statement of values about what our country is founded on, that we believe we all can and should agree on. And I think we need to remain in touch with that, because the last thing we should allow or afford in this country is for certain statements like political violence is wrong to ever become something we disagree about on partisan terms.
So, how would someone, speaking for what I think will be a lot of the people listening in and viewing this, how would they get involved in a group like that?
Well, that's a particular effort. You can go to weholdtruths.com and see a little bit more about that. I think more broadly, it's finding those spaces in our lives that are not on their face political. It could be your church, could be your Elks Club, could be your group of folks you get together to solve the world's problems with at the diner over coffee. Could be your folks you go to Little League with, but whoever it is that's in your circles of belonging that you can talk about these big picture things with, not to pick partisan fights, but to find common ground. And that's the harder part. Frankly, it's uncomfortable sometimes. Uh, but we got to do that because it's actually part of what's best about this country. Remember, American identity is not based on some ethnic or racial background. Being American is different from being French or Japanese, partly because what makes us American is our civic identity, our commitment to be part of that process as citizens, not just as politicians. Engaging in that and then distinguishing between the things we can and should disagree on and the things we must agree on in order to be one country, I think is where it begins.
Well, I always tell people if you want to have a incredible source of pride in America, watch the parade of athletes during the Olympics and look at what an American looks like, right? America
Very good.
looks like
Yeah.
everybody. And that's who we are. And this idea that we're going to divide based on gender or race, it is not good for our country. It's not good long term. I have a question in the chat. Someone said they're running for as a Democrat, also a veteran. Iowa's second congressional district wants some advice on how do you have that conversation in that district to open up a dialogue like you're talking about.
Well, first of all, thanks for stepping up. I mean, it's so important. If you see what's going on out there and you don't see anybody else speaking to it the way you want to, or challenging an incumbent the way you wish somebody would, sometimes you're the answer to that. And it sounds like you figured that out. I can't speak highly enough for the process of lots of cups of coffees. It's how I became mayor of my hometown as a pretty obscure person. Finding everybody in your community who ought to be consulted. And the definition of that, by the way, is anybody you think ought to be consulted, plus anybody who thinks they ought to be consulted. And at the end of that cup of coffee, asking them for two or three other people that you ought to get a hold of to understand what's going on in a particular community or county or neighborhood that's in the district that you hope to serve. And pretty soon you'll begin to see where people, what they have to say rhymes, even if they come down on different sides of an issue. And you can get past some of those partisan divides. Utah is especially interesting because there's a culture of treating each other decently. It parallels what I grew up with in the Midwest. That I think is something we can appeal to across these political divides because there are such outrages against that decency happening right now in our politics.
One other question. What about the federal minimum wage?
Well, the federal minimum wage has not kept up with inflation. It hasn't been updated in a long time. And I think it's an example of something that most people are for, my party and I are for, and yet our political opponents are against. I think it's an example of one of those kinds of issues, like Medicaid expansion, that passed by referendum in very conservative states, or
Mhm.
provisions around women's reproductive rights that have passed in very conservative states, that allows you to get across if it's branded as a Democrat or Republican idea, people might view it differently right out of the gate. But it's the kind of thing that shows whose side we're on that I think we ought to talk about more.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, just a much bigger conversation and working to try and get as much information out there on the big, beautiful bill, because you can already see now that now that it's passed, there's a huge propaganda campaign on the Republican side to say nothing to see here. Only you're going to get big tax breaks, like the Social Security Administration sending out an email, totally distorting what this means for lower income and middle income people. So, we have an obligation to not just, ask people to go out there and kind of have a conversation with their neighbors, but to arm them with reasonable and fair data and
Mhm.
not just biased data. And so I had a friend yesterday who was doing talk radio with my brother, and someone called in and he said, I'm going to get a $6,000 tax rebate from my Social Security. And you're like, there's what you pay in taxes and the deduction from your taxable income. And chances are you didn't pay taxes on your Social Security anyway. And
Yeah.
so this idea, the spin is out there,
Yeah.
and it is really important that we not let any grass grow under our feet in terms of responding. Don't think that the messaging war is over. Democrats tend to say it once and think, oh, I already said it, they heard me, as opposed to repetition, repetition,
That's right.
repetition, and having that conversation. And I know I got to get you out of here, but I just want to say, um, people are thrilled every time they see you out there doing what you're doing, to be respectful in your dialogue, your political dialogue, to be respectful in knowing that talking points aren't always the best way to do this. You've got to understand the issues and have really unique ways and important ways to communicate what the facts are. And so, where can we see you in the next podcast that you're going to do? Where are you going to be in the next 30 days talking about the big, beautiful bill?
Well, I'll be out there. I'm going to be talking about this till I'm blue in the face. So you can definitely find my Substack or other social media channels to see what I'm up to, and
Okay,
hopefully you'll find
Substack,
me.
that's people will
Yeah,
find
that's
you on
that's
Substack.
that's definitely one place where I'm pouring out my thoughts, and hopefully I'll either be in a format, a channel, or a community near you before too long.
Okay, terrific. You're welcome anytime in North
Thank you.
Dakota.
I'd love to get
Okay,
back out
take
there, see
care.
how those railroad
Thank you
crossings are
so
doing.
much, Pete. You're just
Thank
such
you.
an enormous talent, and we're grateful that you joined us here at the One Country Rural Progress Summit.
It's a pleasure.